Just as a prefatory note, I should mention, I was born here in Washington, D.C., but my parents both emigrated in the late 1960s. My father was part of that first wave. There was the Anti-Asian Exclusion Acts. Another panel was talking about the census, and so he was part of that first wave, and he went to school at Howard, which I used to always think was Harvard when I was a young boy, but it's actually Howard University in D.C., right in the middle of the civil rights movement. So he was there when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and the National Guard was sent in and all of that, and he was a mechanical engineer. And so I was raised in this very tradition. He's also what they call a Tam Brahm, which is a Tamilian Brahmin. So brought with him these very orthodox, severe views about vegetarianism, about Brahmin exceptionalism, all of these kinds of things. And he was an engineer, and I happened to be pretty good at math and science, and I went to Science and Technology High School. So there was an assumption that I would be, an engineer. If it was an utter failure, maybe a doctor or lawyer. I mean, poet was somewhere, in between rodeo clown and garbage collector on the, but it was always my passion, and, I went to graduate school, got my MFA in creative writing, and so, but the thing about writing poetry is I've even written poems about my father that are not the most kind, but he doesn't understand them. So he's like, oh, here's this great poem, and it's dedicated to me. So the language of metaphor and figurative language, it's more esoteric. In this instance, this memoir, Correctional, which is the other book, and it'll be out there, is about these very difficult moments in my own life, and they definitely thought that I should not write this book. The South Asian experience was, if you do something shameful or experience something traumatic, you dig a very deep hole and you push it all the way down and you put dirt on it until no one can ever see it again. And so my mother, Amma especially, she said, you went through and survived this time. Why do you want to rehash it and go through all of this stuff again? So yes,
At what point did you show it to her? After it was published or before?
No. Of course, that's the other thing with the memoir, is that I felt ethically obligated to show all the people who were in it. And my mom was very funny. I was mentioning, I think, to Zilka at lunch, that there were certain memories that she disagreed with and said, which I know for a fact happened. She said, oh no, that didn't really happen. And then she was very helpful in correcting the names, because part of the book is about my parents' immigration from South India. And when my grandmother, I was about 10 years old and my grandmother got sick. And so the whole family, because there's this idea of dharma, duty, just picked up and left. And I moved back to India and lived there for 18 months right in the middle of my childhood. So my mom was very helpful in some of the facts and the names of the nuns at the school that we taught at. And also, I'd written about, I have an uncle who was kind of an alcoholic, and I had mentioned that, and my mom took umbrage at that and said, the family will be unhappy if you met. And I actually thought about it, and I thought, is it revealing this adding anything to the narrative? Is there any reason to do it? And there wasn't. And so in that instance, I accepted her advice. But in other cases, I did not.
Interesting. I know my former student Paloma was writing about the idea of assisted suicide in Hinduism, and she was writing about her father who had ALS, and she did show it to her mother, and I remember you telling me her mother couldn't believe that she would mention that she was divorced in public, that was even worse than assisted suicide, and that she'd been divorced for 5 years, and she thought you should not mention it. So is that an Asian parent thing, or is it like a privacy issue? Is there a disconnect between Indian-born parents, do you think, versus Americanized kids?
I don't know. When I talk to some of my Jewish friends, it seems there's a similar Jewish guilt thing that is happening. Yeah. But it was very much. Even growing up in the U.S., there was this idea of what would the aunties think? These mysterious aunties who were sitting in judgment over in India. And, my parents were very much, we lived in a house where there was a formal dining room that we were not allowed to go to. And all of the couches were draped in plastic sheeting. And then when the guests would, whoever was allowed to sit on those couches, they would come off, and so appearances were very important. It was as if anything could happen within the confines of the family, but then to export these ideas. And so my mother's, they would always swap stories of the great successes of their children. That was the language they trafficked in. And so my mother would say, oh, so-and-so, she still does that. She's like, oh, your cousin Anand's buying a $3 million house. It's like, okay, great, good for Anand, you know.
Yeah, I know with my students, I always, one of the rules I say is the first piece you write that your family hates means that you found your voice. So you're a teacher and you teach writing, and I know you've been in a lot of different MFA programs. So do you encourage your students, with, especially with poetry or nonfiction, to be confessional and to not be afraid to write?
Yeah, I mean, I found, and especially with this book, Correctional, which it took me a long time to write, and I had to, every revision, go through another excruciating layer of unpeeling. And so I believe, like, when it feels the writing is getting risky and dangerous, and you're going to a place, not just the place where your parents might hate, but the place that you might hate, that you don't want to go, is usually the place that you need to go. And as I tell my students, it doesn't mean that you have to share it or that you need to publish it, but it probably is. I'm a big believer in bibliotherapy, and I think it's very healing and cathartic to kind of go into those spaces and kind of explore and open it up. So I'm always encouraging. I think that you need to feel safe to be able to do that, and I think that of the workshop as a kind of sacred, safe space where hopefully students feel comfortable sharing some of that.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good distinction, because there's a huge difference between writing it versus publishing it with your name.
Yeah.
Right, which is sometimes some editors that I work with will let somebody use a pseudonym or a maiden name or something like that. Has that ever occurred to you? Because you have such a famous name.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I mean, I have a little essay about that here. If there's time, I can read it.
Yeah, why don't you read it, actually? I love that piece.
Yeah,
this was a piece that ran in the New York Times that launched his...
Okay, so just to give you a taste of one of the essays here, and most of these essays are much more kind of critical. They're studies of Indian literature and digital humanities, but this piece is a little more autobiographical. So it's just called Ravi Shankar on Ravi Shankar. If I had a rupee for every time someone I met has made a Woodstock joke, strummed an air sitar while twanging nasally, or asked me to arrange a date with my daughter Nora Jones, I'd be a rich man. Hardly a day passes without me being reminded of the icon of world music who owns my name. I've lived my life as a doppelganger, a secondary Ravi Shankar. My identity crisis goes back to kindergarten in suburban Virginia, where my ponytail-wearing, beatifically smiling teacher, Mr. Fatuma, took me aside one day to praise me for my precocious reading and inform me that I had a special gift, just like the man I was named for. But it was not until 9th grade that my namesake actually impinged on my world. One day, while loitering with my pals, a mini ghetto blaster pumped out the Stones' Paint It Black. I ventured that I liked that guitar lick. That's not a guitar, that's a sitar, a friend mocked. It's Indian, man, it's Ravi Shankar, you know, the real one. Famously, recently NPR did a piece on the nuisance of having a famous name. The Meg Ryan who's endlessly kidded that Tom Hanks is waiting in the lobby, the Michael Jackson who gets, yeah, and I'm Madonna. For me, this peccadillo of fate has been both curse and blessing. I won't forget the poetry reading I gave, it was actually in Carrboro in North Carolina Library, where as I stepped to the podium, an elderly gentleman stood up. He actually pointed his cane at me and he shouted, "That's not Ravi Shankar, he's an imposter." And he actually turned around, and actually the entire crowd was pretty elderly, and so they were in walkers and wheelchairs, so it took them about 20 minutes to depart the room, leaving just like me with like 3 other people, triggering a mass exit. In the blessings column, I would put the gold embossed invitation I received years ago to a Roberto Colasso book launch in the Pierpont Morgan Library. Boldly I went, taking a friend with me for an evening of Dom Perignon, lobster canapes, and flirtatious conversations with socialites. Why on earth, my friend asked afterwards, did they invite you? A slight error of name, I explained. For a time, it became my mission to meet the real Ravi Shankar, feeling obscurely that personal contact would somehow close some existential loop in my life. I rehearsed how that encounter might go. Namaste, Ravi Shankar, I would say. I'm also Ravi Shankar. Or, greetings, Pandit Shankar. I'm deeply honored to make your acquaintance, having been gifted with your name and with it the motivation to live up to your majestic reputation. No, fortunately, the meeting never happened, and Shankar was spared my dismal theatrics. I did meet his daughter and co-performer Anushka at a cafe concert 10 years ago. She spoke rapturously that night about the deep pleasure she and her father found in playing rags, melodies prominent in Indian classical music. Etymologically, that word raga means color or hue, but also passion. The goal of the rag is to create a trance-like mood of ecstasy. For me, there comes a moment when the music simply takes over, where your mind ceases to clamor and instead joins in a dance with pure sound. As Shankar writes in Ragamala, music is like worshiping, and through music, you worship God. That's the feeling that swept over me whenever I heard the Pandit play live. I recall at a 2005 concert in Boston how small and frail he looked, how large the sitar that he held was, lovingly as if holding a child. He opened with a vandana, a folksy invocation to Hindu deities, and followed with a tarana, a fugue-like form based on the call and response of Sufi poetry. But the highlight was the raga duets between father and daughter. It just happens to be my daughter Talia's 14th birthday this weekend. I remember how Pandit Shankar looked at Anushka as they played together, beaming with pride as if to say, my time has passed and hers is just beginning. And now he is gone. Ravi Shankar was the ideal ambassador for Indian culture. As an artist, he was a great hybridizer, respecting tradition but innovating freely, collaborating with George Harrison, giving lessons in Indian classical music to John Coltrane, merging musical technologies with classical instruments and dancers from the Bolshoi, working with Philip Glass on the chamber music Passage for Passages, writing film and TV scores. Shankar's unbounded creative curiosity, steeped in the classics but pointed always towards the new, is something I aspire to every time I write. In some ways, some curious way, being named Ravi Shankar emboldened me to pursue writing, a career that my father, traditional-minded, regarded as I mentioned, the equivalent to rodeo clown, the hierarchy of suitable professions. I nonetheless forged ahead into my art, my path cleared by a fellow Ravi Shankar who made a similar decision and pulled it off spectacularly. And while I still might put Nora Jones as not among my survivors in my obituary, I want to thank Ravi for the great good fortune in sharing his name. I will take good care of it, Pandit.
I love that piece. That's a great piece. So, okay, so you've written in so many different genres. So poetry, essays, memoir, translation, and then you have a lot of book reviews and cultural commentaries. So how do you decide with what you're working on, the form, or do you just start writing and let it follow your own?
Wow, I was just actually at Jay's talk, this last talk, where there was a great discussion about form, and I tend to agree. It sounds a little oracular, but I think that form kind of tells you in the process of writing what the shape wants to be if you can listen really very closely. And so intuitively, I'm a poet. I mean, writing correctional, I mean, this memoir and kind of learning, I could really describe the interior of the spaces that I was in really quite brilliantly, but the larger contrivances of plot, characterization, dialogue, the fact that a story has to keep moving. It needs forward momentum. As a poet, I'm more interested in lyricism, in some ways in a certain timeless, ruminative quality that would not translate at all in my experience of writing a memoir that someone wants to read. That book, I felt like I could not, very briefly, I think I may have the dubious distinction of being perhaps the first American academic to be promoted while being incarcerated. So when this happened, I was at a state university in Connecticut, and it became pretty large kind of local news. I was in the front page of the Hartford Courant, and I was on the local TVs, and a lot of the coverage was sensationalized, salacious, even erroneous and false. And so it felt like I needed to reclaim my story, and in order to do that, I needed to use a medium that could reach more people, and that I could. And in the book, I ended up, it got me, this is one of these things, right? The most awful things that happen to you sometimes turn out to be a blessing in disguise. And so for me, these things I knew theoretically about the racialization of mass incarceration, the utter lack of rehabilitation that exists, all of these things I experienced firsthand, and it just kind of like opened my eyes in this really big way. And so part of the book is a history of mass incarceration in America. There's a little digression about Buddhism. There are all of these different elements that a poem, I think, would not have been able to contain. So that's why it felt like that was the right thing. And then, I think being part of a community of writers, if you're ever interested in writing reviews, it's a great way to kind of engage with others. And so I've been commissioned on occasion to do things like book reviews, and I'm interested. There's an essay about the history of collaborative practice. I've done a lot of collaborative writing, and so I kind of wanted to trace that history, which goes all the way back. I mean, I love particularly things and practices that seem really postmodern, but in fact are actually quite archaic. You were talking about the zuhitsuge, which is a great, form invented in high-end period Japan. A form like the cento, which is this like patchwork form, like a pastiche and a collage. It's like a mashup, and yet the first centos were written by Aristophanes, who took lines from Aeschylus's plays and put them together. And so, I guess I'm interested in the way in which kind of innovation evolves out of history in some way.
And as a writing teacher, are you specific when you give your students assignments, like if anybody wants to get started? For example, in my classes, sometimes just to get great first-person essays, I assign write 3 double-spaced type pages on your most humiliating secret. And we even pinpoint, for example, like the New York Times Modern Love column, or the Washington Post has a few columns where they're open for that, and we aim for that. So when you're in your nonfiction classes, are you specific when you give assignments?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we do a lot of different prompts of various kinds. I think the last assignment we were looking at the lyric essay, so they're writing a lyric essay about anatomy, of personal anatomy of some kind, and we looked at different examples. I think we looked at Eulabis's pain scale and different ways in which the body is talked about. I love writing prompts. And when I was in the MFA program, that's what I loved, is having assignments, because that would get you to start writing, to start generating. There's something also about form and assignments that seems imprisoning, but it actually is generative. It pushes you in directions that you didn't think that you would go. And I often feel like even if there's just like a sentence or a kernel from the free write that you can then use and turn into something, it's been worth it.
And when you do cultural commentaries or literary pieces, do you ever pitch editors? Do you ever write a pitch letter to an editor and say, there's these 2 upcoming books that I'm interested in, kind of thing, or people mostly come to you?
Mostly people have come to me. Yes, I mean, there have been some cases, like I wrote an essay about Aga Shahid Ali, and there was going to be an anthology, and the editor, Kazim Ali, wanted someone to look at his use of humor specifically, and so asked me if I would do it. I have pitched other kinds of pieces, but the book reviews and things, I used to be also just a regular reviewer for the Contemporary Poetry Review, and so I would get dozens of books in the mail, which was both lovely and kind of overwhelming, really. But I would get to pick what are the books that I'm interested in. I mean, I stopped kind of reviewing as much when I realized I wrote a review of, I won't say who the poet is, but it was a poet who is also was the editor of the Harvard Review, which I didn't realize at the time, and it was I think a fair review. I believe in the kind of Randall Jarrell model of a reviewer who both kind of praises but also takes a writer to task sometimes and calls out places, and hopefully the writer in response can then integrate that and become even better, right? There's a kind of symbiotic relationship. That doesn't seem to exist in literary reviewing anymore, as I found, because then I was like, oh, I'm blacklisted from the Harvard Review, and I will never publish there as long as because this guy was really kind of pissed at what I wrote about him, which I don't think was that mean. I think it was fair. But so yes, that kind of self-congratulatory aspect of it was like, well, I'm not.
It's interesting. I used to review a lot. I was on the board of the National Book Critics Circle, and they used to send us everything that came out. So I one year when I was poor, I think I made $8,000 back from the Strand just from selling the books back. They would come to you with boxes of books. But when I started writing books, I stopped writing reviews because not only was it a conflict of interest, but I realized it's so hard to write even a bad book that I started over sympathizing with the author, and so it became impossible to be as critical. I think I actually like teaching because I feel like if I'm critical with a student, it could help them be better. But I started feeling guilty. Once the book is out, there's nothing you could do about it except to show off that you're so smart that you know exactly what's wrong with it, but it's too late to fix.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually kind of the ethics of reviewing. It reminds me of, there's Pete Wells is a restaurant reviewer of the Times, and he has this very iconic review of Guy Fieri's restaurant, where, very funny, if you don't know, you should look it up. But he talks about how he would only have done that kind of review for someone like Guy Fieri has restaurant
He killed
chains.
Peter Luger's.
Oh, Peter Luger's as well.
Peter Luger's,
yes.
yeah.
But he said, if it was a mom and pop restaurant that, opened up, this is not the kind of review that he would write, right, necessarily, so.
He also encourages the wrong things. I met him. He encouraged this restaurant that I love. They got a new chef, and it was the most bizarre, obscure food you've ever seen. And he encouraged it, and they went out of business like a month later because they refused to do like the chicken and shrimp and things that normal people want to eat. So hilariously. So I actually have fights with certain critics, and I have ongoing fights that they don't know about in my mind when I read them.
Yeah.
Are there any critics right now that you do you read, like did you like Kakatani or Dwight Garner?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, the food critic I used to really love was Jonathan Gold, who passed away in the LA Weekly. I mean, his reviews are really something, and they're both kind of cultural commentary and kind of the Anthony Bourdain way. Yeah.
Yeah, so I noticed, and I really enjoyed a lot of the literary references, and I know you mentioned in Telling the Hemispheres, Salman Rushdie and Bharati Mukherjee, whose work I love, and Nepal. So who would you consider, especially with Indian writers, who was important to you?
Well, in part, I think when I was in grad school, I went to got my MFA at Columbia, and I don't think I was exposed to a single poet of color besides Langston Hughes and maybe Maya Angelou and maybe Robert Hayden. When I think back on it. And so it was a long time ago, I'm not as young as I appear on stage. But, and it got me kind of thinking and wanting to find out, because there's such a rich, diverse history of Indian literature, and it's hard to make any kind of comment. India is truly a subcontinent. I mean, 22 different languages. My mother tongue was Tamil, so I grew up speaking and going to temple ceremonies, and I knew about this great wealth of kind of Sangam era poetry, this older poetry that wasn't really being translated at all. And one of my first, Mina Alexander, was an early kind of supporter of mine. And there was also a late poet, I think people might not remember her, though a little bit infamous, I suppose, Rita Kavazarani. I don't know if anyone here remembers her. She was a very fine poet, very sadly took her own life and the life of her son with the poet Yusuf Kuminyaka years ago. But she was a wonderful, supportive person. I didn't know, there weren't a lot of South Asian poets. There's Vijay is here. Hopefully you'll be able to stay and listen to him, but Vijay I've known for years and was also really very supportive, and I think a really fine poet. And then there are all of these, when I edited this big anthology of contemporary South Asian, East Asian, Middle Eastern poetry, I discovered like the Bombay school of poets, Dom Moraes and Nizam Ezekiel, and there were so many names of poets who are not published here. There's another great press called Zuban, which is a feminist press. They publish my translations of Andal, but they publish all kinds of really interesting work. There's like interesting Indian graphic novelists now, and so many different writers. Yeah.
And what about memoir? I mean, I think Salman Rushdie is just coming out with his second memoir, and Juba Lahari, I think, has an interesting memoir out. Were there any Indian writers whose nonfiction you...
Yeah, I mean, I did like Naipal's kind of Histories, little trilogy of being in India. Though Naipal's a little problematic. Raj has got a great book that has just
Colorful
come out.
Palette, yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And I mean, I don't know that I necessarily read a lot of memoirs. I mean, the memoirs I was kind of looking at before I started correctional were things that I would go back to, like Mary Carr and Tobias Wolff. I mean, kind of standard kinds of memoirs. But yeah, have you read Rushdie's memoir?
Not the new one. Not the new one. The other one about the fatwa. Yeah, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah.
And actually, he's writing now about the when he was almost killed.
Yeah.
It's the new book.
That's right.
I always say to my students, I paraphrase Arthur Miller, who always says the best thing to write about is the unspoken and the unspeakable. So, and it seems like you go there. You go for the jugular. Is that intentional with your work? I mean, with the essays and the memoir. And the poetry. Yeah,
I mean, I guess as a poet, I feel you have a responsibility to the invisible, the ineffable, the ununderstandable. It's the poets that are on the frontier of trying to find the words that can potentially describe some of this stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think particularly, I mean, this memoir for me was a lot about processing my own shame about what happened, what I kind of did, taking personal responsibility, but then also the inherited shame of knowing what my parents went through when I was going through this difficult time, right? And it's the fame and shame are two sides of the same coin, right? And in some ways, because I had wanted to be this, I was a semi-public figure in Connecticut, and I'd been on the radio, and I was, wanting to be this public figure, and all of a sudden, I was very public for reasons that were not the right reasons, right? And so, how to kind of like deal with that, and this idea of, people are really complex, and this is one of the lessons that I've learned is that I have so much more empathy to so many more people because of what I've went through, and I realize that in my own mind I probably have certain fixed ideas of people, but of course we can all change. And George Saunders, who was mentioned before, has this idea of kind of radical empathy and trying to kind of meet someone where they're at to understand them and engage in dialogue with them. And I've been kind of keeping that practice, especially, if you're talking to someone on the opposite side of the political aisle from you, or even at this conference, we probably have people that have different ideas of Indian nationalism, right? So how do you have these difficult conversations and still kind of be respectful?
And I know a lot of your work and some of what you showed me, so you say your experience navigating spaces as a bicultural American, and you also talk about a diasporic identity. So do you think that that's essential to not only to your work, but to your own identity? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think that idea of feeling almost a certain sense of a double exile, right? And a lot of bicultural people can understand this, I guess, but when I was growing up in Northern Virginia, I was considered too Indian. I had, of course, as many immigrant children do, the quintessential lunchbox moment. My mother used to make me these wonderful thalis with 4 different courses and puris and what I wouldn't do for that. And I used to, on the way to the school bus, because I was teased the first time I kind of opened this up in the lunchroom, I would dump it all out in this bush on the way to the school bus, and then I would often just starve for lunch. I mean, when I think back on it, it's but that kind of pressure to assimilate. So I was never, even though I was born in America and I spoke English, I played soccer, I loved monster trucks and Run DMC, it didn't make me American. And then I had the experience of going to India all of a sudden, and in India, they were like, oh, here comes the American cousin. He sounds like John Wayne. Here he comes. And so all of a sudden it was oh, I'm not Indian either, so where am I? And the interesting thing is, for a writer, it allows you to kind of just step back and observe. And so I think I spend a lot of my time living in India, just kind of observing, not fitting in, but when you don't fit in some ways, it both kind of makes you interesting and allows you space apart. I think I explore this a little in the memoir, but I was raised with these two conflicting, my father believed in this idea of kind of Brahmin exceptionalism, that, to be vegetarian and to never have alcohol, and I had a sacred thread ceremony, a punal ceremony, kind of made you very pure. And yet I was also, so in the home I was being taught this message of exceptionalism. On the outside I was being taught this message of being less than and being discriminated against and being made fun of because of my parents and because of my skin color and accent and all of these things. And so as a young boy, like having both sides of that was very confusing, I think. And especially when I returned to the US after being in India for 18 months, having experienced the most marvelous things, playing cricket on the rooftops with my cousins, and wandering the streets of Mylapore, but I didn't have the language or ability to communicate any of these extraordinary experiences when I came back to my American classmates. In fact, I felt like communicating these things would make me even more different than them. And so what I did instead is I kind of created this compartmentalized secret self, which I think in the end, if you're not able to kind of bring together all the different sides of yourself, it leads to kind of fracture or potentially something traumatic, as it did in my case, I think.
Now, I've been teaching writing for 25 years at NYU, the New School, Columbia. Now I teach online. And let me see if you had a similar experience. Early on when I was teaching, I think that there were a lot of my students of color maybe were apprehensive to tackle race or to tackle economic issues or to be political. And it seems as if lately it's, I have a lot of editors and agents actually who Zoom into my classes now, the online classes, who are desperate for diverse voices. And they're sick of white privilege, and they feel like they're intentionally looking for more political, more identity-driven pieces. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is more of a willingness to write about these kind of political issues, but I also feel like it doesn't mean that the editors, it's not an unqualified, we're interested in diverse voices. We're interested in diverse voices telling particular kinds of stories that we believe we can market and will sell. And so for me, it was always, when I was in a workshop at Columbia, anytime someone would bring up like elephants or curry leaves, everyone would turn to me as if I was the expert, like, Guru Shankar, please tell us. But then I kind of internalized that, and I felt like, well, I should know more about like the Vedas than this Teutonic Upper West Sider who's sitting across from me, and it made me somehow more interested. I think now, yeah, absolutely, diversity is really in vogue, but my trouble sometimes with my students is that they can be a little polemical sometimes and a little preachy, and there's a little bit of like virtue signaling and vicarious outrage, being offended on behalf of other people. And I don't know that all of that makes for good art.
I remember Raj in my class wrote about, I think a very popular piece he wrote was about loving Desi Arnaz as a kid because it was a family that was, his family, your dad was Indian and your mom was Puerto Rican, right? Puerto Rican and Italian. So he wrote about pop culture as, one of the few places at the time that he could see a family that was similar, right? Yeah. So so I understand exactly what you're saying. So maybe political rage is harder to sell to newspaper magazines, whereas pop culture or your own personal story might be easier.
Yeah, and I don't know if, this is an experience I had very recently. I'm still kind of trying to unpack it, but in my poetry class at Tufts, there were a couple of students of color, but one student of color who did not have the same level of like expertise as some of the other students, and who asked me, like, wanted additional help. And so in workshop, I would make, as I do with everyone, kind, constructive, blunt comments about everyone's work. And in doing the evaluations, there were like these students who were offended on behalf of this other student of color. And in fact, anything this student of color would submit, the other students would all simultaneously be like, oh, it's brilliant. Don't change a word. It is just amazing. Which seemed to me like almost its own kind of racism in a way, right? That particular student in the evaluation thanked me and said, like, I haven't grown as much as a writer ever before. Thank you so much for your feedback. Meanwhile, there were these other students who were like, oh, we really thought when you were like calling this person out, it really made us all uncomfortable, and it, you know, so it's really different negotiating. Yeah.
Interesting. So, what advice do you give? Because I know there are several writers in the room. So, what advice do you give? I personally find, even though it's a rough time in publishing, I personally find that there's more online newspapers and magazines who are willing to be open to new voices, even if they're just paying a couple $100s for short pieces. And I see some former students here who had luck. So do you think it's a good time to be out there? In fact,
yes. And I just was on a conference call with someone who is trying to convince me to help him with a kind of a screen treatment for Hulu. And it was saying that, especially like in Hollywood, there's this real appetite for Asian stories, for diverse stories. And he was like, this window is not going to be open for very long. And so, you know, we need to kind of like take advantage of it if we can. I think that's partly true. I don't know, what has your experience been like?
I mean, a lot of people complain because, you know, the newspaper business has been very difficult, and, you know, some newspapers and magazines have gone out of business, but online, because so I get students from all over, I find publishing left and right that there are many, many more places that are open to new voices. I do think you have to, like, for example, have a timely lead or play off of something that's going on in the news. That's like a trick to get into a newspaper. Like, for example, your beautiful piece on Ravi Shankar, I'm sure the fact that he had just passed away gave it like a timely angle.
And I actually had a draft of that ready to go, knowing, I mean, you know, he was old. It's like, when's he going to be gone so I can be the only one? No, I'm just kidding. Yes, no, but I mean, it's actually great advice. So if you have pieces that you know that there will be a kind of a seasonal news peg, right? I mean, we're coming up on like Thanksgiving and the holidays, which is going to happen year after year after year. And so if you can kind of like write something knowing, there was recently, I helped edit this book of the Golden Shovel, which is this wonderful form Terrence Hayes edited based on Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, We Real Cool. And Gwendolyn Brooks, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the day of her passing or something. And so, of course, there was a lot of Gwendolyn Brooks related stuff. And so I was able to publish some essays at that time.
By the way, I just said to my students, if you're in a hurry right now in the November class, which ends December, write a piece that involves Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, New Year's. And it could be, you know, an experience. I mean, you've written hilariously, Raj has written hilariously about food in his family. And I know Paloma's written about having lost her dad and what it's like, you know, so what it's like for the holidays. Anything going on with the holidays as a lead, I think is right this minute. That's a great, and especially if you're from a diverse family that celebrates holidays in an interesting way. You know, like what do you like? You know, I always, you know, Jews are always like going for Chinese food and movies on Christmas. So there's always like funny pieces about that. So like, what do you do, you know, during these Americanized holidays, or do you have your own family rituals, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I think my students don't know, you know, anyone can pitch. I mean, if you have a good pitch and you can convince someone why you're the right person to tell a particular story, you don't have to have the best credentials necessary. Editors will listen. I mean, the other bit of advice, I mean, for me was to read voraciously and widely and read things that I normally would think that I would not. I mean, I'm a bit of a word nerd and a collector of language. And so for me, you know, when I was bored, I'd read the back of cereal boxes and scientific texts and whatever, and, you know, collect interesting concepts and words, because words beget other words, right? And if you can kind of own and possess language, it can kind of help you.
Great, and if anybody's interested, I have flyers. If anybody wants to ask about how do I get started writing, or where do I publish, or that kind of stuff, that's the thing that I teach. I think we have.
This was lovely. You talked about how some writing that you've been reading is moving toward more of the polemical, and it doesn't necessarily make for good art. So what does make for good art?
Oh, I see you're giving me the same kind of easy questions you were getting. Well, for me, good art is multidimensional. it's not something, the works of art I return to time and time again. Every time I encounter it, I find some new nuance or shade of meaning. I think it feels both surprising and inevitable at the same time. It has that feeling of, wow, how did we get there? And of course we got here, there could be no other way, right? I think it needs to, I mean, sometimes, what did W.B. Yeats used to say, if it does not seem a moment's thought, all my stitching and unstitching has been not, right? So that you have to work really hard to give it the feeling of being kind of effortless and kind of conversational.
I just want to add, one of the things I love the most about Ravi's work is when it seems like he's courageous and self-deprecating and sort of not afraid to go there, you know. So even the Ravi Shankar piece, the idea of this is a very famous person that has my name and I'm not as famous and I might feel intimidated, that sort of underlying feeling. And also with, you know, I absolutely loved when you delved into the correctional about being in prison, someone from your background and the feelings of failure. So I would say that, you know, part of what I love about your work is that you're not afraid to go there. You know, that it's not on the surface. And I like, how did you say it? That it should make you uncomfortable. If you don't want to write it, that might be a good sign that it's.
Yeah, and I feel like really good art engages you holistically, right? So it's not just your mind, it's not just your heart, it's not just your spirit, it's not just your body. It's somehow all of it in some way. And so it's like, what was that famous Supreme Court definition of pornography? I know it when I see it. That's what good art is. It's like.
Good. Any final questions?
So, being a creative person in general, growing up in America, did you often feel like an outsider in the wider Desi community, as a lot of people in our generations, you know, were more into pleasing their parents, going into engineering and those kind of traditional fields. So did you feel like an outsider at all in that way?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, we used to have these great South Indian parties where all the kids would like congregate in the basement while the adults were like, you know, doing stuff upstairs. And I even remember back then they were like, oh, he's a wild one. Like, you know, I was interested in, yes, and actually most of my cousins, it's funny, my generation, most of them have come to get educated here or in London, and they're all in the more traditional fields for sure. So, I mean, but I find now when I meet Desis, they're all always kind of impressed, and now it seems like the cultural climate is changing, so that more of that is happening.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much, and by correctional and tallying the hemisphere.